So in the previous part, we talked about abstract user interface. So these are the abstract events that might occur in your system that you're prototyping. So now let's go on to the next follow-up item. What will be the consequence of occurrence for these abstract events? They will be abstract states. Think about the abstract state is simply a representation of the system. How you actually represent the system is completely up to what's your purpose for development and also testing. Let me give you some guidance here. So your abstract state should really include all the relevant details for the functionality that you want to test. So the functionalities under testing will be the key. Want to know if you want to test for deposit, you want to test for withdrawal, for example, what would be the crucial state information to include? Balance, for example, and also for the account owner to know if you really deposit into the right person's account. And then you want to exclude all the other irrelevant details. For example, maybe in this case, the name of the bank may not matter. And also the name of the branch of the bank also doesn't matter. And also the address of the owner also doesn't matter. So you don't need to include every detail in your abstract state. Let me give you some example. Exactly how you represent your abstract state is completely up to your judgment. But luckily for lab number 3 and also for your projects, we tell you already what the format of the abstract state should be. But later on, if you want to build a prototype yourself later, you have to decide how the abstract state should look like. Let me give you some example here. The easiest one will be, let's say, how do we represent the abstract states of a bank ATM, right? Let's say the easiest one will be we simply display the bank as a set of owners. So that will simply just be Alan, Mark, and Tom. You can see this abstract state here is very simple, but it's also maybe lacking. For example, if you want to test for balance, there's no balance information over here, but it's simple. Okay, let's make it a little bit more complicated. We can say we also want to add every owner's balance. In this case, we'll say Alan has $200, Mark has $300, and Tom has $700. Again, there's no really right or wrong answer for abstract states. If you only want to worry about the creation of the account, for example, in that case, you just want to know if you added an account for Alan, one for Mark, one for Tom, that would be sufficient. But if you want to really test for balance, in that case, you have to include the balance information as well. We can make it even more sophisticated to say we also want to show the transactions each account has undergone, maybe for today. In that case, we can say account owner will be Alan, that'll be the first account, and for each account we'll also have their list of transactions. And then we'll say plus for deposit on the particular dates, and also this is the amount, and etc. And let's say for this particular account, let's say they have no transactions for today. In that case, that will just be empty. In your lab number 3 and also the projects, once you understand about the range of abstract events you can have, you should really study very carefully, maybe in the example that we gave to you or in the instructions about what the format should be for the abstract state, especially for your project that's coming, right? Since it's a 5-week project, so the abstract state is rather sophisticated at the first glance. But once you study the structure and know what to really output, you will be fine. Okay. So that's about the abstract states. So now that we know about abstract events for abstract UI, and so we also know about the consequence of occurring at particular events, so as the abstract state. So now we know how to write acceptance test. You can see so far we haven't talked anything about programming, meaning that in order for you to write acceptance test, you do not need to have any knowledge about the internal programming details. That's a very crucial thing to contrast against unit test, in which case you do have to know the programming details. Okay, let's take a look at acceptance test. So let's talk about inputs versus output for the acceptance test. I'll also show you on my iPad in just a moment. Let's put some definition here. An acceptance test, the input is simply a use case. Use case means what's the scenario of interacting with the customers interacting with your application of the system under test, characterized by a sequential occurrences of abstract events. So basically, it looks like this. So we're saying that we want to test this particular scenario over here. Let me just describe it over here. So this is the picture you should really have in your mind. So what we're doing is we have some system under development. Usually people just call it SOT, S-U-D. And then we got the inputs for acceptance test over here. So the input is going to be simply a list of events over here. So we'll simply say we want to create a new account called Alan. We want to create another new account called Mark. and then we want to deposit into Alan some amounts. We want to deposit into Mark also some amounts, and also we want to transfer from Alan to Mark some amount. So this is a use case scenario. We want to make sure the consequence of these events occurring will be exactly what we expected. In that case, we got to see the output, but we'll get to the output in just a moment. Okay. So that's about input. You can think about input will just be a sequence of events that would like to test your system. So whenever you run pass the input as a sequence of events into the system under development, they should really generate some output to tell you what the consequence is of running these events. Okay, let's take a look at the slides and see how we can define the outputs for the running these events as the inputs. So output from running an acceptance test, a sequence of events, is a sequence of interleaving of abstract state and abstract event, meaning that you start with initial states, followed by an events, followed by the states, followed by the events, followed by the states, and etc. Let me just make it very precise to you, and I'll give you example. Okay, just to really make it precise, this needs to be mathematical. So this will be the general form of the output from an acceptance test. It will be some initial states S0, the first events to take place, and then another states followed by the second events, followed by the next states. So how do we interpret this particular sequence? And by the way, to really separate between states and events, we got the dash greater than. You see this symbol here in the ETF interacting terminal there. So think about S0, we call that the initial state. That's where your system start with, without any events occurring just yet. And then Si will be the pre-states of events I plus 1, and I will be starting from 0. Okay, let's try to just do one example. So you can see S0 over here is the pre-states of E1. You can think about S0 as a starting state for E1. And also S1 is a starting state for E2, and etc. Okay? And then we talk about Si will be the post states of event Ei, and the I will be larger than or equal to 1. What does that mean? Think about S1 over here. Okay, that'll be the first one to look at. Think about S1 is the resulting states by executing the effects of E1. S2 is the resulting states by executing the effects of E2. Okay, it's pretty intuitive. That's very symbolic, but I'd like to go over one example together with you. Okay, and then I'll give you a little exercise to answer. Okay, let's go back here, and then again, let me just annotate very quickly for you. So you can think about S0 over here is the initial states or inits, and one example for pre-state would be think about S1 over here with respect to E2. S1 is the pre-states. And also, let me use red over here. If you think about the S1, the same state over here, with respect to E1, it is also the post states. You can think about there are two roles that each state is playing. So it's actually the pre-states for the next events. It's also the post states for the previous events. That's how you can think of it. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And then one example output could be like this. Remember we talked about the abstract states, right? So now let's say we only want to display the middle one that we talk about. We want to display the account owners and also their balance. So this will be the initial bank states, which means no account is there. So now after executing the new Alan by creating Alan account, Alan is going to be there. So you think about this is the pre-states for executing the new. And this is the post states of executing the new, right? Pretty straightforward. And then after executing the creation of Alan account, so now Alan is of balance 0, right? And then if you try to do another one here, let's say if you want to create another account called Mark, and then after that you can see the resulting state will be Alan is still there, and also Mark is also added. And then if you try to deposit Alan with $200, so now Alan has become 200 in balance, and also Mark remain to be 0, and etc. Okay, so this is just one example output from the acceptance test. Let me just make it even more visual for you. Think about we have the state will be in red. So these are the states over here. These are the states, and interleaving with the corresponding events over here. So these are the events. Okay, so just get used to this particular format because you will need that in order to develop your Lab 3 and also the project and to do regression testing. Okay, let's have some very quick exercise for you. Okay, you can try to answer that. Okay, the same exercise, the same example over here. So initial states, well, that's easy. Should just be the empty, right? So that's the initial states. And now this will be a little bit trickier over here. What does the state? What rows does the state Allen 200 Mark 0 play? For example, you can see this is exactly the state over here. As I said before, each state actually plays 2 rows as a pre-state and as a post-state. But what is this particular state the pre-state of? And what is this particular state the post-state of? That's the question. Okay, maybe pause the video and come up with your answer. Okay, so now it will be for Allen 200 0, that should be the post states of this particular deposit events, right? And also it will also be the pre-states before you try to execute this particular deposit, right? So that's the second one. Okay, just make sure you're comfortable with the pre-state, post-states that we talked about previously in the course, and also how you can understand and interpret the results for the acceptance test output. Okay, so now finally, before we move on to the actual ETF idea, so let's say a question for you actually. So based on what you have seen so far about the acceptance test and versus unit test, let me just give you one example to formulate my question. So we got acceptance test. You can see we got abstract states, we got events, so interleaving abstract state and also the event as we said before, versus the unit test that you wrote previously for your previous lab, right? In that case, you have some test in the context of some ES test class. And you can think about unit tests is also can be done in Java, in C#, in other languages as well. But now we declare some local variable of the account. Apparently, we're assuming that the account is part of your implementation. There's a class called account. And then you have to make as a constructor, and also you got to add routine. Presumably, the add is to really implement the deposit transaction. And then you want to make sure after depositing $200, the balance should become 200, right? That's a unit test. So now here's a question. The question is, what's the difference? What's really the difference between an acceptance test over here and also a unit test? Come up with really the different different from different angles to really list the differences. Think about it before I show you the answer. Okay, the answer should be, let's go with the unit test. As you can see, the unit test over here, as I said before, in this case, it assumes that you actually got an account class. But remember, all the implementation detail should somehow be hidden when you actually ship the products to your customer. The customer may not need to know about what classes you have developed, created to really develop your solution. So now I would say for the unit test, it does require the knowledge about, number one, the programming language. If you didn't know about Java or didn't know about iPhone, how can you write a unit test like this? So number one, it does require some proficiency for the programming. And also it does require the knowledge about the details of implementation. You should know there's such a class, and also these are the routines you can call on the class, on the objects, right? So that's a unit test. On the other hand, before I say that, and what can be the users of the unit test? Well, I would say it's mainly the developers, because developers should really have the the in-depth knowledge about the programming language they're using and also the implementation detail or the design, the design architecture. Okay, what about the acceptance test? It's kind of the completely the opposite. In order for me to write an acceptance test, it only requires familiarity with the abstract UI and also the abstract states. Let's try to relate to the example that we saw previously. Okay, so here, in order for me to write such acceptance test, to really know about, I need to spell out new, deposit, and also pass the right argument values over here, or in order for me to specify the expected output, to tell the developer this is what I need in order to satisfy this particular use case scenario. In order for me to do either the input or the output, there are two things I need to know. Number one, I need to know about the abstract states over here, abstract UI. So these are the events I declared previously in order to abstract away all the irrelevant details about the physical user interactions over here, right? So number one, it will be the abstract UI I need to be familiar with. Number two, I should also be familiar with the abstract states, which will be, for example, you can see there will be a set of owners and their corresponding balance over here, right? So that'll be the abstract state. So these are the two components I need to be familiar with. No programming knowledge is required in order for me to write an acceptance test, really. As long as I have a meaningful communication between the customer and also the developers, they know about the vocabulary they have to speak about the application, it will be enough to write an acceptance test. So that is why who will be written and running the acceptance test. It will be customer, okay, just for communication. The customer can actually use the acceptance test input output to actually tell the developer, this is what I need. So think about in your lab number 3 and the projects, right? Think about your instructor and the main TA. We are the customers. We want you to build a software for us. In that case, we kind of give you some starter test with the expected output. In that case, it will be simply just of this kind of format over here. And then that's more like a communication mechanism. We tell you exactly what we need in some small number of cases. And if you want to test more as a developer, you can also run the Oracle to check those scenarios. So that's for communication. And then for you as a developer, you can also run the acceptance test for testing. So every time you are done with a particular functionality in your model cluster, in that case, you can also test a new scenario to really make sure it's really correct, right? So it's really important for you to understand the difference between acceptance test and also unit test. Let's recap very quickly about the terms we have been discussing. Let me switch back to this example over here. So in the case of the acceptance test, so let's see, these three are the abstract states over here. Okay, let me just put it down over here. So these are the abstract states. And also this part over here, new and also deposit, just two examples. So these are part of the abstract events, which are part of the abstract UI. So these are abstract events. And in order to see the complete list, you will need to refer to the abstract UI. Okay, and then okay, that's about the components for abstract for the acceptance test. So what about unit test? That's something you know pretty well already. So now the things I'm going to highlight right now in red. So you can see account over here, the class we can use, and also the make as a constructor, and also the add, and also the balance. So these are all the implementation details, right? Implementation details. Meaning that in order for you to really write a unit test, number one, you should really got the knowledge about how to write things in that particular programming language. And number two, you should really know about that particular implementation detail, what class you can use, and also what routines you can call. Okay, so that's a very quick summary about putting the unit test alongside with the acceptance test. You should really know the difference between them. Which one should you use? You should really try to use both of them throughout the stage of your developments.